I've just finished my Plus Pop quilt top, which is fun to say, and now I need to make the backing for it. But I don't want to do it. I don't know why. I literally only need to sew one seam, but for some reason this is just a task that I always put off. And if you are someone that also puts off the task of making your backing, you're not alone. Every day, quilters around the world are delaying this one simple task, but no more. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I'm going to be taking this yardage and I'm going to be cutting it, sewing it, trimming it, and pressing it in order to make a backing that's going to be perfect for me to either send to a long armor, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to long arm this, or I'm going to be showing you as well how you might want to prepare this backing a little bit differently if you were going to be making it to quilt on your own domestic sewing machine. There's not going to be any tears, there's not going to be any stress, and there's not going to be any more delaying. Let's get to it. I tend to make quilts that are throw size, which means that they're usually 60-ish something inches wide and 70-ish inches tall or long. And I know that if I make a quilt that is about that size, I'm gonna need somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 yards of fabric. So what I like to do is I like to scour my local quilt shops and my online quilt shops because they will often do a deal on 5-yard cuts of fabric, and that's what this is. So I purchased this from an online shop and they had deeply discounted cuts of 5 yards of fabric. And that's a benefit to them, I think, because then they just have to make one cut and they sell lots of fabric. And it's a benefit to you or me as the customer because now you get this deeply discounted chunk of fabric. So when I'm shopping for fabric, I usually look for prints that I think will just kind of mix with a bunch of different, I pick prints that I like basically. And I think that if I pick a print I like, it'll probably match with something I'm going to make in the future. For instance, this fabric right here that I purchased months ago, I had no plans for, but look, I made this quilt top and these two are gonna go together really well. So this has got oranges and pinks in it, and it's just a coincidence that I made a quilt that had oranges and pinks in it. I didn't plan for these two things to go together. I also will often shop for fabric that is non-directional. I just find that that's more flexible for me when I'm making my quilt backings. But I also will, if I find a real cute one and it's directional, meaning like say there were Christmas trees or something going up on this, then I would definitely still purchase that because I know that a 5-yard cut of fabric will work whether I turn it sideways or topwise. So what I mean by that is, picture this 5 yards of fabric. If I pulled it all out, it would be 180 inches long. We're gonna say long. If I cut that right in the middle, so I've got two chunks that are 80 inches long, and then I sew them together along one big long seam, that's gonna give me a backing that is 90 inches long by about 80, let's say 2 inches wide, because you know, you're gonna like cut off the selvages and you need a 1/2 inch seam allowance, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So I know that if I've got a chunk of backing fabric that's 80 inches by 90 inches-ish, that's gonna work for the vast majority of quilts that I'm going to make. And bonus, because a 5-yard cut is actually larger than I need, I could, if I needed to, orient it so that that seam was vertical and it was running from the top to the bottom of my quilt on the back. And then that would ensure that my directional fabric would all be going in the correct direction. So yes, I can shop for directional fabric. I just tend to pick fabric that is not. So for instance, this one with the diamonds, I guess it's directional because you can see that they're all kind of going in one direction, but who cares if the diamonds are facing up or if the diamonds are facing sideways, right? That doesn't really matter. So I would consider this kind of a non-directional print. So I like to keep my eyes open for deals, and I like to pick fabrics that I just like, and I like when I can to pick non-directional fabrics. And that's how I choose my backing fabric. If you want to know how big your quilt actually is in order to find out how much backing fabric you're going to need, you need to measure it. I have measured this one and found it to be 64 inches wide and 72 inches tall. So let's talk about how much fabric I'm going to need. I'm going to be sending mine to a long armor, me. And that means that I need an extra 4 inches on all 4 sides. I need extra fabric as a long arm quilter in order to load it onto the machine because I need space to actually attach it to the machine, and I need space on the sides so that I can attach it as well on the sides and sew off a little bit over the quilt top. So I need 4 extra inches on all 4 sides. This is let's just talk about the width for starters. This is a 64-inch wide quilt. So if I have 4 extra inches of fabric on this side and 4 extra inches of fabric on this side, that means that I'm going to need to add a total of 8 inches. 64 plus 8 equals 72. So I know that I need 2 cuts of fabric that are 72 inches wide. I'm going to cut those from this 5-yard cut, and then I'm going to seam them together along the selvages. So if I were to do that and then sew it, that would give me a piece that was 72 inches wide by approximately, and I say approximately because you know you cut off the selvages and blah, 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 approximately 82 inches tall. And that's fine, that's gonna work for me because I said that this quilt top is 72 inches tall. So if I have a backing piece that is 82 inches tall, that's an extra 10 inches, which means I'll have an extra 5 inches at the top and 5 inches at the bottom. So that's gonna work great for me because I'm sending it to a long arm quilter, me. If you are going to be quilting this on your domestic machine, you do not need all that extra fabric. You do want to have some extra fabric around the perimeter of your quilt top, but it's up to you to decide how much. If I was doing it on my domestic machine, in what world would that happen? I don't know, but let's say that that was happening, then I would want at least probably 2 inches on all 4 sides just so I could breathe easier and make sure that I'm not gonna run out of room. But you do whatever works best for you. So I've got my 5 yards of fabric that I purchased from the quilt shop, and I'm going to use my biggest cutting mat, which happens to be 36 inches wide. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just gonna trim up this edge because you know what it's like when you get fabric from the shop. It's not always the straightest or the squarest. So now I'm going to lay this out and match it up to my 36-inch line. I'm just going to grab it here with my thumb and then just pull it over. So again, it's not gonna be super rocket science, this operation that I'm doing here. I'm gonna line my thumb up on that 36-inch line, and then I'm going to cut my fabric using a rotary cutter and my ruler, a nice long ruler that I have. So that should be approximately 72 inches because I measured 36 inches twice. I'm going to line up my ruler along the fold, the top fold of the fabric, and I'm going to cut towards myself. So if that offends you, then look away. There we go. So I've got one of my 2 cuts. So this is one length that is going to be wide enough to go across my quilt top. Now I need to cut the next one. I'm just going to repeat and do the same thing. Should I have thrown that on the floor? We don't know. So I don't think you need to watch me do this, but just in case you want to and you want a thrill, here we go. So again, I'm lining up this piece along the 36-inch line. Then I'm going to grab it over here, and this one's going to be a little less accurate because there we go. Because I had a ruler in the way, but now I moved it. I'm going to put my thumb over here on this 36-inch line. Spread this out a little bit. And I'm going to cut it again towards me. And then I will have 2 cuts of fabric that are approximately 72 inches in length. So, you know, it's not a big deal if they're a little bit shorter or a little bit longer. But I think if you were to make an arrow, you'd probably want it to be a little bit longer rather than a little bit shorter. And again, I'm just gonna cut towards myself. There we go. So now I've got my 2 pieces of fabric and I need to put them together. Let me show you how I do that in the next step. Wait, I forgot to mention. You'll notice I've got all this extra fabric. So this is it's more than a yard of extra fabric. That's great for me. I'm not sad about this because I paid 50% off for this fabric, and now I can just fold this up and put it in my fabric stash, and I'll have an extra piece of low volume fabric that I can use for another project in the future. So even though I didn't need all 5 yards, I could have gotten away with 4 yards of fabric. My quilt shops don't sell backings by 4-yard cuts, they sell them by 5-yard cuts, and I'm not sad to have paid 50% off for this beautiful piece that I can definitely use in the future. I've got my 2 pieces of backing fabric that I've cut to be 72 inches long. Now it's as simple as just putting them right sides together and then sewing one big long seam, and then I'm almost there. Couple things though that I want to mention. If this was a directional print, okay, let's say that this was directional, there would be Christmas trees going all in one direction with their little points at one top and their base at the bottom. If I were to sew these together with these 2 big printed selvages together, that would have my trees going in opposite directions. So instead, what you want to do, if you've got a directional fabric, and maybe even if you're just trying to maybe even if it's not a directional fabric, but you're just trying to keep things looking the same, you want to sew one printed selvage and one non-printed selvage together. So I'm going to flip this top one on top back towards me, and then I'm going to pin along this edge. So I'm just going to pretend that this is a directional fabric and that I want everything to be going in the same direction. Okay, I was not expecting this fabric to be running away from me quite as much, but I'm simply going to place one printed fabric and one printed selvage and one non-printed selvage together, and I'm going to pin along this edge. This will work a lot better vertically. Here we go. So we've got the fabric right sides together. The two selvages are together. I'm going to just scoot this top one down a little bit more though, so it'll be actually aligned on the side. Then I'm going to take my pins and I'm going to pin every, I don't know, couple inches or so. And the pins are really going to help when I go to sew this together, because the pins are going to help make sure that the fabric doesn't shift or move as I'm sewing it together, because there is kind of a tendency for that to happen. And you might have noticed that I made absolutely zero effort whatsoever to pattern match, and that's because I don't care. This is a busy quilt backing that I chose specifically for this reason. But let me know in the comments if you want to see a video about pattern matching your quilt backings, because that is something that I can do, but I just don't care enough about, certainly not with a pattern like this one. That does not matter to me. Okay, I'm going to continue pinning along this edge until I come to the end, and then I'll talk to you about sewing this one long seam. My two pieces of backing fabric are all pinned together and I'm ready to just get sewing. But there's a couple things I want to mention before I do that. So most of us would probably think, let's just sew a 1/4 inch away from this fuzzy edge, and then we'll press it open or to the side and we'll be set. But I would caution you against that. Number one, if you sew a 1/4 inch away from this fuzzy edge, you will be sewing on the selvage. And the selvage is the part that's the very, very edge of the fabric that is a different weave and a different texture than the rest of the fabric. It's thicker and it's denser. And it's got a different tension to it. So if I was to sew my seam right along this edge and I would be catching that selvage, then the tension on that seam would be different than it would for the rest of my quilt back, and I wouldn't want that. So number one, I'm never going to sew that close to this edge. Number two, I don't like to leave any part of this printed fabric in my quilt backing. And that is because I often choose light fabric for quilt backings. And when I do that, if there's a printed edge like this, if I leave this in my quilt backing, I'll be able to see this fabric clearly. Like if I look at the back of a quilt backing and it's got the fabric in there, you can see it on the quilt back. So I'm going to cut off this whole section. So just imagine that any part that is colored or printed, I'm going to cut it off. It's not going to be in my quilt backing. Plus from there, I'm going to want a nice wide seam allowance. So I'm actually going to take about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So imagine that this printed part is gone. I could have cut it off in the beginning, but I chose not to. And now I'm measuring a 1/2 inch away from this printed line. So this is where I'm going to be sewing, a 1/2 inch away from that printed line. And I'm simply going to use the lines on my sewing machine to find something that I can line this edge up with, because it's got markings on the bed, the throat plate of my sewing machine. So I'm just going to sew that together and off I go. A 1/2 inch seam allowance though, you might be like, Shelly, is that really necessary? And I can tell you that it'll lay flatter and it'll look better if you have a larger seam allowance on your quilt backing. I see lots of quilt backings come through my door, and the ones that have a tiny little seam allowance on the back, sometimes a 1/4 inch, sometimes they're like 1/8 of an inch that people are sending me, they have a harder time laying flat. And when I say flat, I'm going to actually press this open. Are you worried about that? I hope not. Sometimes I have people tell me that they're worried about pressing a quilt backing open. Number one, I know that the machine is going to stitch across this a million times. When I go to put this on the long arm, I know that this line of stitching is going to get stitched over a million times. So I'm not worried about it coming unraveled in the future. And number two, I'm actually going to use a piecing stitch length or a slightly smaller, shorter stitch length. So on my machine, I would probably use a 2.0 or a 1.8 stitch length on my Juki sewing machine. And those Smaller stitches are going to ensure that this is going to withstand the test of time and it's going to stay together, this one seam that I'm sewing. So let me take this to my sewing machine and then I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, here I am at the sewing machine and I've got my needle lined up so that it'll be a ½ inch away from this printed part. And I actually ran off the numbers and letters on my sewing machine, so I can just see that if I keep the edge of my fabric aligned with this hole, then I should be fine. So I'm going to start and stop. I'm just going to do a little bit of back stitching at the very beginning of this stitch. And again, I have adjusted my stitch length to be 1.8 is how much I set it to. And my tendency, my instinct here is to go as fast as humanly possible, but I find that I get better results if I go a little bit slower. So I'm just gonna slow and steady, let the machine pull the fabric through, keeping that edge aligned with that hole. And I'm just gonna stitch the whole way down until I've got all 72 inches stitched. I'm just coming to the end of this line of stitching, and once again I'm going to do a bit of back stitching just to make sure that that is nice and secure. I'm going to cut the thread, and now I'm going to remove all of the pins that were in there. Normally I remove pins as I'm stitching, but my machine was not stitching over top of these, so we were safe, and I did not have to remove them as I was going. They were far enough out of the way. I will show you what I'm going to do next in just a second, as soon as I get these all out of here. But it's going to involve some trimming. The seam allowance has been sewn. So I sewed the one seam that I needed to make this quilt backing, which was not that hard, and it only took, I don't know, less than a minute for me to do that. But now I've got all this extra fabric that I don't need, so I'm going to trim it off. For that, I'm going to use my rotary cutter, and I'm going to use my ruler. And I'm just going to align the ½ inch line on my ruler with the seam that I just sewed. So that'll leave me a ½ inch seam allowance, and if I have marked and sewn fairly correctly, I should mostly just be cutting off this printed part of the seam allowance. And in fact, that is what happened. So I'm just going to scoot this along and just trim down the whole thing. Won't take very long, and it's going to give me more professional results where this fabric is not going to end up in my quilt backing. And I'm just making sure that no bits of it have ended up in the quilt backing, because that would be sad. If you have to end up with a smaller seam allowance but you get rid of that printed part, that would be the choice that I would make. So let's say I hadn't sewn my seam allowance quite accurately, and in fact I only ended up with like 3/8 of an inch of a seam allowance. I would rather have a slightly smaller seam allowance and no printed fabric in my quilt backing. That would be a choice that I would make. And this one last little bit right here, it's gonna get rid of this extra. ½ inch, ½ inch. There we go. So that is my extra, and now my quilt backing has got a nice ½ inch seam allowance in it. But I'm not quite done with the trimming. I want to take a look at the sides of these two. So it's pretty normal when you make a quilt backing to have your sides not quite match. And I hope you can see this on the overhead camera, but they do not. They do not quite match. They're out by a ¼ inch, and in some places by a bit more. That's really normal. And it can be caused by a number of different reasons. Number one, maybe I cut the two pieces not exactly the same. I was just kind of like, you know, using my finger, my thumb, and like pulling it over and cutting it. So maybe I didn't quite cut the two pieces exactly the same size. Maybe when I started pinning them together, maybe I didn't quite align them perfectly. Or maybe when I sewed them together, they didn't exactly, like the fabric might have shifted a little bit. Or it could just be that my fabric cuts were not that straight. But because I'm going to be loading this on a long arm machine, I'm going to take the time to trim the sides. It's like I can't move my hands because this whole thing is just going to slide right off the table. So I'm going to take the time to trim up these sides. And I don't think a lot of people know this, just based on the quilt backings that I receive. But if you're sending your quilt to a long armer, they would really appreciate it if you would send them a backing that is square-ish. So it doesn't have to be like perfectly square, you don't have to measure the diagonals and make sure everything's exactly the right same size. But if you send them a piece that's got like an overhang that's 2 inches, that is a lot harder for a long arm quilter to load on their machine. So I'm gonna take the time and I'm just gonna fold up, hopefully this will not fall off my table. I'm just gonna fold this up so that my seam allowance is, my seam that I just sewed is fairly parallel with the selvage edge, and I'm just gonna cut off a little bit. So I can feel under here that there's a difference. I need to cut about here in order for that to be square, so that the edges are about the same. And I'm gonna check the other end of the fabric as well while I'm at it, just to see. This was the one that I started with, so they should be a bit closer together. And in fact, they're a little bit closer together, but I'm still just gonna give it a quick trim because future Shelly is gonna be really grateful when I go to load that on the long arm. Like this tiny bit of difference is not such a big deal, but honestly, like sometimes I get quilts that have like, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches of extra fabric hanging off the side. And it's not that I can't load it like that, it's just that it is harder because you gotta find the center of everything, and that can be kind of a challenge to do when you're loading something on a long arm. So there, now I've trimmed off both sides, and now I've got a piece of fabric that I have sewn together that should be approximately 72 inches. And yes, I did just cut off a little bit of it, but I don't think it's enough for anybody to worry about. So my long armer's not gonna get mad at me about that, and I'm not gonna get in any trouble. There's still gonna be enough fabric here for the long armer to work with the width. They would probably rather have a quilt backing that is more square and is, you know, a 1/4 inch short, rather than one that is got a big overhang on it. So this piece should be about 72 inches long and about 82 inches tall once I've, you know, I just cut off those selvages, etc. So next up is pressing. My seam is sewn, but now I need to press it, and I'm going to press it open. And I'm gonna use a little tool to do that because although I could try and dig out my iron, there's not really a lot of room in here for me to set up my ironing board and show you what that looks like. So I'm just gonna use this little finger pressing tool. I'm gonna put a link for it in the description below, but I just find that it's a really handy little nifty tool that does a great job and is a great alternative for getting out your whole ironing board. If, I mean, by all means, if you would prefer to iron yours using an ironing board, go ahead and do that. Don't let me tell you how to live your life. I mean, do what feels right for you, but I'm just gonna use this little tool because I think it's pretty fast and easy. And again, I'm pressing this seam open because I'm not worried it's going to come undone over time, because I know that this sewing machine, when I go to actually quilt this, is gonna quilt over this a whole bunch of different times, which is really gonna secure this seam. Plus, remember that I sewed it with a slightly shorter stitch length, a 1.8 or a 2 on my machine, so I know for a fact that it's going to be nice and secure and it's gonna stand the test of time. So there we go. So now my seam is pressed, and in fact, I do have to press the rest of the quilt backing. So the joke's on me. I do actually have to dig out my ironing board and my iron, but I just wanted to show you this nifty little tool, and that works really well for me. So here's my quilt backing. It should be about 72 inches wide and 82 inches tall, which is gonna work well for this plus pop quilt that I have behind me. I don't know that my arms are long enough to actually show you, but it is wider. It is wider than my quilt top, which is gonna make my long armer, AKA me, very happy. So I'm in love with this quilt backing. You know, it wasn't very hard to do. It didn't take very long to do it, and I had been putting it off for no reason. So I'm glad this video was a great little encourager of me to actually get out there and actually make this. So if you're like me and you've got quilt backings that you've been putting off, I encourage you just to get to it, because as you saw, it's not that hard. And that's how I make a quilt backing out of yardage. Did anything about my methodology surprise you? If so, drop a comment below so that we can discuss. And if you're like me and you really want your backings and your quilt tops to be nice and flat, you'll definitely want to check out my review of the Reliable 270 IR iron. It's a powerhouse beast of a machine that I just would not want to live without, and I've made a full review where I share all the things that I love about it, plus the things that I do wish that they would change, because although it's great, it's not perfect. As always, I'm wishing you happy sewing, and I'll see you in my next video.